Society of SOAS for inviting me. Very happy to be here. What I thought I would do is speak briefly, not for too long, because I don't think what I'm going to say is going to be news to anyone in this audience, as far as Pakistan is concerned. So I'll keep it brief and then encourage however many of you want to ask questions, which is, I think, a better way of proceeding. So very, in summary fashion then, here goes. In my opinion, Pakistan now is probably in a worse state than it has been as long as I can remember. Socially, politically, economically, culturally, militarily, the country is a wreck. Now, it's not a wreck in the sense of a failed state, because that's a word I don't like. It is essentially used to target particular countries. It's not a failed state because its people are resilient, they want to live, they want to survive, they go through natural disasters and human disasters with an amazing fortitude and courage. So we know that, and the only thing that one wonders is how long they will carry on accepting this particular form of rule without exploding, like the Arab world has finally done. That's an interesting question, which we can discuss later. What are the roots of this process in Pakistan? It's a long-term process. I think one of the roots of the crisis is the inability of the Pakistani bureaucratic military elite to allow the country to develop organically, good or bad. And the constant disruptions in the country's life by military coup d'etats first led to the breakup of Pakistan as we knew it, the 1947 Pakistan in 1971. And after that, led to the disruption of political life and civil society, however weak it was, by another coup d'etat. And when that happens, then politics in particular and the attempt to create a civil society crumbles. It can't last. And instead of political parties becoming meaningful, political parties themselves degenerate and gravitate around the one force in the country that everyone recognizes as there, which is the military. I mean, I've been told by military generals, retired mainly, because the ones in power don't talk freely, at least not to me, is that they were shocked when they were in power, running cantonments and running garrisons. The number of politicians, and they said even during periods of civilian rule, the number of civilian politicians who used to call on them to discuss with them. And one of the generals who was in law, he said to me, I said very bluntly to these guys, I'm a military man, I don't know politics, I don't want to go home. You don't have to come and pay me visits on Eid and bring gifts, I don't want. But once you get into that habit, which our politicians have to, knowing that sooner or later the arbiter in the country is going to determine what happens next, i.e. the military, then politics itself becomes pretty meaningless. And that is something which has been a shadow on the country for a long, long time. And that is a big difference with India. People say there's no difference with India. That is a big difference. That in India the military has never intervened to take over the land. Nor would it. The country is so huge. In Pakistan, we have been run by institutions essentially that were handed down by the British, the bureaucracy and the military. And these organizations have become, if you like, over is that in recent years, this is something, of course, which has been a constant in Pakistani politics, and which I described at length in my last book on Pakistan, is the domination of the country's foreign policy and its military by the United States. It's nothing new. It is carried on from the beginning. And here we have a real structural problem, if you like, which is that the people who took power in Pakistan after partition in 1947 were not themselves used, for the most part, not everyone, but for the most part in their majority, they were not used to independent politics, and they were not used to taking decisions independently of the imperial power. Most of the politicians in the Muslim League were people who had collaborated long years with the British. And politically and psychologically, they didn't know what to do. And this is another big contrast with India, that the Indian politicians, whatever you may think of them, had led a large, enormous mass movement to get rid of the British presence, which had lasted a long time. The guys who took over Pakistan were not part of that, except for a very limited period, i.e. the 12 months before the British left. And this made them weak people. I mean, Jinnah, who wasn't weak, but was intelligent, died very rapidly. And afterwards you had essentially claques of quarreling politicians ganging up to take power or to stay in power, if necessary on their own, but preferably with the help of the bureaucracy and the military, and to prevent democracy from functioning in the country because they were fearful that in a country that is what Pakistan was in 1947 onwards, where a majority of your population lived in East Pakistan and a minority in the West, there was always a chance that the East Pakistanis might get a majority, which they wouldn't have because there were many different parties in East Pakistan too, so no one thought like that in those days. But by constantly driving the Bengalis into a corner, what was provoked was Bengali nationalism. And finally, when the elections took place, the Bengalis did win a majority. And here you now saw the weakness of the political military elite in West Pakistan. Instead of accepting that, they decided to crush it. And that broke up the country. Subsequently, we had an experiment, the People's Party experiment, in populism, if you like. That again aroused huge hopes, huge hopes, very few of which were fulfilled. That it was a popular leadership was not in doubt, but this leadership had promised much and delivered very little. And the key problem, which I've argued in all my writings, which no government has really taken on, including the government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, when he could have done virtually anything, or that party in power could have. Two things needed to be done at that time when he came to power. Pakistan was crushed, defeated. For the first and only time in the history of what was the new Pakistan, you had a political party that dominated all. Military discredited after the defeat. Bhutto went and negotiated the release of 90,000 prisoners and got them back. His prestige was high. Civil service weak. Other political parties weaker still. What could this party not have done? It could, for instance, had it been so inclined, carried out what the country has been crying for decades, a huge and meaningful land reform in Pakistan, which broke the power of the big landlords in Sindh and the Punjab in particular. Absolutely elementary. The Indians did. And one of the reasons the Indian economy could take off much more than we could is precisely that they had begun to sort out the land problem. That you did not have the huge landlords in power in India dominating politics as we did in Pakistan. And this was a big failure. And every time it was promised, we will have it, because they knew it should be done. Even the military dictators knew. But they couldn't do it. Or they refused to do it, let's say. Bhutto put it. He had campaigned on that. And the manifesto of the People's Party pushed very hard for a land reform, but he basically used it as a sword over the head of the landlords and said, if you don't join my party, the sword will fall. So it became an instrumentalist business. Nothing to actually change the way of life that had dominated the countryside since the fall of the Mughal Empire, basically. So this was, in my opinion, a huge problem and remains a huge problem in Pakistan today. And landlords today who say the choice is either us or agribusinesses are right on one level, that is what the system seems to be able to offer, but that is not an alternative, set of alternatives that should be accepted by any modern thinking progressive countries. You know, there are other things that could be done. Small farmers should be encouraged. Rural banks should give cheap, very low interest loans. All this can be done if the political will is there. And the political will has always been lacking. And the domination of the countryside over the cities politically and culturally has been such that even when you have businessmen politicians, the first thing they want to do is amass land. Because that is seen as the privileged thing to do. If we have land, we can be considered feudal. It goes extremely deep in the culture of Pakistan, this notion. And it's something that should have been, could have been dealt with and wasn't dealt with. Secondly, what the People's Party government of the 70s could have done was to have cut down the size of the army, drastically reduced military spending, and used that money for building an social infrastructure in the country on the level of education, health, and housing. That too had been promised, and that too wasn't done, and it could have been done. Afterwards, when that whole experiment, mainly faulty, had been swept aside, then we had a transformation of the country in a way that is still with us. Because if you look at the period in Pakistan's history which brutalized its political culture, that was the Zia military dictatorship. And we never really recovered from that. Everything that has happened subsequently has followed from that particular period. Officially sanctioned religious fundamentalism, armed gangs of Jamaat-e-Islami students wrecking the culture of the universities, bullying students, firing on students they didn't like, imposing what they wanted with guns. There were more guns in the universities during that period than before or since. And this is a problem still with us. The laws that were pushed through by Zia, making women effectively second-class citizens, still with us. Neither Benazir, nor Nawaz Sharif, nor anyone else could get rid of these laws. They were too scared of the mullahs, even though the mullahs themselves are divided on these things. They are not at all united. There is no such thing as a monolithic Islam in Pakistan, and never was. And this is what people don't understand. I mean, for instance, when there was the big anti-Ahmadiyya riots in the 50s, the Pakistan government afterwards set up a commission of inquiry They set up a commission of inquiry, and this commission of inquiry questioned all the chiefs and leading people from all the religious sects in Pakistan. And they said no one could agree on what constituted a Muslim. And Justice Kiani asked, very sweetly, he said, if you don't know what a Muslim is, or if you regard the venerable gentleman who has come before you not as a Muslim, then we're in great trouble. Because this country is going to become completely sectarianized and divided. It's a very, very important document, that Commission of Inquiry report, which should be made compulsory. And that period of the Zia dictatorship in which the West intervened, again linked to Afghanistan, created a huge mess. A huge, huge mess. The political brutalities within the country were deliberately designed to scare people off. Public floggings, public hangings, which had never happened in the country before, under any regime, including previous military governments. Why? To frighten, to scare, to say this is our way. I remember a horrific debate that took place when they were implementing what they called Islamic laws. And there was a big debate in Pakistan as to what would happen when thieves were punished. These are largely poor people for any offense, because Islamic law said that their hands should be cut off. And there was a big debate between Sunni and Shia theologians in the Pakistani media, in which they said, should we cut off the hand simply at the fingers to incapacitate it? And the Shia said perhaps just at the fingers, leave one thumb. And the Sunni theologian said, no, we should cut it off at the wrist, because if you don't remove everything, the person can steal it. And I listening to that at the time, I just wondered where this country was going to go, where it was going to end. And this was normal. Mercifully, Pakistan's doctors proved quite solid, and they couldn't find a doctor to perform the operation to chop off hands, so people were sentenced to it. And that is what I mean by brutalizing the political culture of the country. You hang the elected prime minister, you flog, you hang criminals in public, you beat up journalists, you create a security force which becomes increasingly more and more powerful, linked to the war in Afghanistan against the Russians. That is when the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence, became the huge force it is today. Prior to that, it was essentially an intelligence agency operating like most agencies do. After that, it became a ginormous organization because its main function was to train the Mujahideen who were going to fight in Afghanistan and give money to groups who could act as auxiliaries. All these groups today, which the government is fighting against, without exception, were born at that particular point in time with money, help, training provided by the Pakistani state or by the United States in Colorado. That is essentially what happened. And then you look at that situation from the 90s onward, and it got worse and worse. Civilian governments were too weak to do anything, the military more and more dominant, the ISI acting, intervening effectively in politics. I was told by politicians from virtually every political party it wasn't uncommon for a major or a colonel from the ISI to walk into our home and try and say, don't have X or Y as the candidate. So You had the Taliban then becoming more and more independent of Pakistan, though not completely breaking. You then had 9/11. And the Pakistan army was recalled this time to go and tell the Taliban not to fight, so that the NATO would take Afghanistan without bloodshed. And they did it. The military intelligence went and told the Taliban to fight, and the bulk of them didn't. And the others decided to wait. So, this is a situation which has been very close. And as some of us predicted when this war began, it would go badly. And that the reason this war would go badly is not very difficult to understand, which is that the Afghans don't like being occupied. They didn't like being occupied by the Russians. They didn't like being occupied by the Pakistanis when they were there, which is why the Taliban began to push their Pakistani minders more and more back to Pakistan. And interestingly enough, virtually every Afghan government, and by the way, including the Taliban government, put in power by Pakistan, refused to accept the Durand line as the border. This has been a traditional Afghan policy, regardless of who's in power, including a pro-Pakistan government said we'll do whatever else. We can't accept the Durand line. No, that can't be our border. Karzai's position is exactly the same today. Not that he matters, because without NATO he wouldn't be there, but nonetheless that is his position today. So having got the Pakistani military to unravel the only victory they had ever won, which is taking Kabul with the Taliban, what did they expect? Had the war been over quickly, had they permitted a genuine election and then pulled out, who knows, maybe things would have calmed down. I don't know, you can't now say. But the war in Afghanistan is now one of the longest wars in history. Longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War, longer than the Vietnam War. A war that started in 1979 is still going on, with different powers intervening and interfering. And you can imagine that the Afghans are exhausted at the time. And now, 10 years into this last war in Afghanistan, what do we see? We see essentially the United States more or less recognizing that this war can't be won and opening negotiations, which they did 5 or 6 years ago with the Taliban. That is what is going on now. And in order to do that, they need the Pakistani military. And at the same time, we have a situation in Pakistan where Pakistan's longest, closest ally, upon whom it depends, the United States, violates its sovereignty without any second thoughts, attacks, launches drone attacks against its population. 2,000 civilians have died. That's the figure, the latest figure. And then carries out a Hollywood-style operation in Abbottabad. Catherine Bigelow is already working on a script, I'm told. And I'm not joking. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. She's working on a script. Who will pay our generals, I don't know. But it's an astonishing operation which they carried out in Abbottabad. I mean, as any of you who read my work know, I have no time for Osama or that organization. On the other hand, I'm not in favor of people just being bumped off and killed and their bodies thrown into the sea. You know, what is this? If you want to capture someone who is not even resisting, as we now know, why don't you capture him, try him? Let's have the evidence. But they didn't want to do that. And then why throw his body into the sea? Why not return it to his sons who were demanding it? I mean, that has caused anger, including amongst people who don't, who are very hostile. Saying this is not the way to operate. I mean, what precedent does it establish for other countries? Anyone can now do it? US does it, they charge with war crimes. So this latest episode and the drone attacks have created, without any doubt at all, a rift inside our armed forces, inside Pakistan's armed forces. The occupation of the naval headquarters in Karachi, carried out by insiders. This was not an outside force. The Corps Commanders meeting, which took place the day after Osama was killed. Who were the Corps Commanders? They're the central people in the Pakistan Army. What were they reporting? Saying there is huge anger amongst the Jawans and in the army messes amongst young officers, saying, who are we? Are we an independent country? Do we have any sovereignty at all? And for the first time, the High Command realized that they were vulnerable. They were vulnerable from within. Now, many people have been telling the United States this for the last 10, 12 years. Not just people like me, their own people, saying stop this particular type of action because everything we do is destabilizing Pakistan. They don't listen. They carry on as before. It's almost as if they want the country to break up. And behind it, there's no doubt, one big egg behind it, which they haven't said in public, but it's no secret, is they essentially want to defang Pakistan, take the nuclear weapons away. That's what they want to do. And were they to go ahead and do that, then I think you would have a civil war in the country because the military would then split. Without any doubt. You would then have what you're saying you want to prevent, a civil war. Because that would be unacceptable. One hopes they won't go that far, and the pressure on that comes from one power and one power alone, Israel, which does not want its monopoly of nuclear weapons in that large Middle East, Near Eastern region.